All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. I'm Thomas, and we do educational material here on this channel. We are doing our 120th video on the reciprocal system of theory, which is a theory of everything derived by Dewey B. Larson back in the 20th century, and he died back in 1990. We're looking at an interview that he did in 1984 at the age of 85, 86, 85, and uh, he still had a couple more books in him at that time. But this is a good summary of like where he's coming from, what his history was, and how he looked at the theory, how he kind of understood what he was doing at the time, and what's in store, what's up ahead, looking back 40, almost 40 years ago. And just to give you a brief update in case you haven't tuned in before on the reciprocal system, it's a theory of everything. In Larson's universe, he conceived of a universe of motion, not a universe of matter, not a universe of energy, but a universe of motion, where motion is the relationship between space and time, leaving space and time to be reciprocals of each other, meaning that space and time don't really exist. They only exist as a relationship or a ratio or a fraction in motion. So motion is always a relationship between space and time. Space or time is the numerator, and space or time is the denominator of the fraction. Space and time also, because we know that space is multidimensional, 3 or more dimensions, time therefore is also multidimensional. And so in that fraction, both space and time could be, a higher power. Like, for example, the quality of acceleration. Acceleration is space over time to the second power. Something like capacitance, space to the third power over time. Now, Larson disagreed with that assessment of electrical capacitance, but it seems to pan out in the equations. And that's just the point, is that if you are able to, codify all scientific phenomena as a relationship between space and time, then you can use specifically, uniquely, and exclusively space and time as your units. You don't have to mess around with mass and, like the MKS system, mass and kilogram, what is it? I don't even know. But you have only space and time. So you could end up converting all of the units into space-time units. So in Larson's system, mass is time to the third power over space to the third power, whereas energy is simply time over space. And then pressure is time over space to the fourth power. So pressure is energy over volume. Time over space is energy. Volume is space to the third power. So pressure is time over space to the fourth power. Force is time over space to the second power. Impulse is time to the second power over space. And so on and so forth. Now, we're going to take a look, take over here in the middle of the interview. He was talking about his career as a mining engineer, and kind of how this was way back in the 1920s and 30s, and how he started to learn through his experience as a mining engineer that the textbooks were wrong in many respects. And he also started to suspect that there was something fishy with all of these constants that they used in, especially in quantum mechanics, where they had all of these different numbers that represented constants. And so he was talking specifically about the Benedict Webb-Rubin equation of state, which he says has something like 7 or 8 of these adjustable constants, which means that when you've got it, you still haven't really answers because you don't know what the constants mean and what constants to apply in what substances. You've got to go out and check that in the field every time. Question, you have to try each one. Larson, it's a curve setting process, actually. You try to draw an equation which you can adjust here and there to the point that you can assign these constants and come up with the answers. As a matter of fact, the quantum theory is on the whole very much the same thing. These quantum numbers are the same kind of adjustable constants that they're putting in the equations of state. What I wanted to do was what we have, I lost my spot here. What I wanted to do is what we have done now, at least part way. That is what I was illustrating in putting my periodic table vertically instead of horizontally, so that each element gets a set of numbers not taken out of thin air or determined from experiment or anything like that, but from pure theory. And to the extent that we have arrived at equations such as that for the interatomic distance, they are theoretically explained rather than being, as Feynman said, merely quantitative. Okay, so that is kind of where Larson is coming from. He is attempting to go back to the first principles and to assemble his universe based on theory, not upon, the math. He's saying that he wants his theory to be conceptually correct, not just mathematically correct. Where like the quantum theorists, in many cases, they are like the theory is mathematically correct, and conceptually, these things don't mean anything. They're just numbers. There are no concepts that are backing this up. It's just strictly about the numbers. And I think Heisenberg was probably maybe the foremost on that. Just there is no theory, there is no concept. These numbers don't mean anything. Okay, so now we'll get back to the interview. So the question, but you also started with a mathematical approach. Larson, I was trying to do exactly what the constructors of the equation of state are doing. I was trying to find mathematical equations in which numbers could be assigned to these different substances, exactly as the rest of them were doing. The only thing is, I came down to the point where I recognized finally that that wasn't going to get me what I wanted, because ultimately I am going back to a number that is arbitrary, or a series of numbers that are arbitrary. So I finally decided what I had to do was to get to something that is meaningful to start with and work the other way. Question, did you write up these researches? Larson, there is a handwritten manuscript, something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, of what was probably the first version of the book. It dates back to about 1930. Really, that far back? Yes, sometime between 1930 and 40. No date on it, but I think the first chapters were probably written around 1930 and the last chapters right around 1940. That was the original manuscript of what eventually turned out to be the book that was published in 1959. But of course, I was in the process of writing that over a period of 20 to 30 years. And as I say, that's very much like digging up ancient ruins. But it may be of interest like all ancient ruins, if nothing else. This manuscript that I'm talking about was not written for publication. It was written to keep my ideas in coherent form. Question, you must have intended to publish it eventually, though. Larson, I didn't start with it, no, because I had no idea at the time I started that I would have anything that was complete enough to be worth publishing. You see, I had no intentions at the start to go into a new theory of physics. I was tackling a particular problem. Question: what was the first significant result from this research? I understand that you started to get results sometime in the 30s, especially this equation for interatomic distances. Larson: well, it's a little hard to say. I was working on a number of things somewhat intermittently, and this interatomic business was one of them. But that was the thing that finally shoved me into the need to discard the idea of building mathematical solutions. If I couldn't solve that problem mathematically, that of course carried on into the more general operation too. Here I was working on a problem that should have been purely mathematical as far as I could see to start with. You get certain elements and you're trying to find why they have certain properties. If you can identify these elements by numbers, then you should be able to get mathematical solutions. But the trouble, as I finally realized, is that there is something wrong with the view of the problem on which you're basing the mathematics. And when that is the case, you're not going to get the answer until you revise that view of the problem. So from then on, my work was angled toward getting the right view of the problem rather than in getting the right mathematics. And in a very large percentage of the cases, when I got the right view, I didn't need any mathematics. Take the vibration of the photon. In order to have a vibration, you've got to have two forces. You've got to have something that throws you off equilibrium and then something, a restoring force that brings it back. Working from this view, it's a mathematical problem, and that's what I was trying to calculate, just as other people were. And none of us got anywhere. Finally, I concluded that I had to get a better view of the problem, when at last I realized that a simple harmonic motion is just as fundamental as a linear or translational motion. I had an answer that doesn't require any mathematics. You start out with motion, and motion as such can occur in different forms. In translational motion, you don't require anything to keep it going. It just is. That's Newton's law. Anything that is in motion stays in motion until acted upon by an outside force. So if you can do that with straight motion, then he's figuring you can also do it with simple harmonic motion. Now, what's interesting about this is that Larson's critics, not critics, but the people that that have attempted to revise Larson's work have focused on his model of the photon as being basically his most fundamental mistake. And they're saying, they even go further than he's saying. So Newton is saying you put something in motion, translational motion, and it tends to stay in motion, and so you don't need a force that's making it move once it's already moving. Larson's saying, okay, that applies to the simple harmonic motion also. But the people and that's where he got the basis of his photon, and he's saying he doesn't need any mathematics. But the people that have revised Larson's photon say that the photon is actually a birotation. It's two rotations that are kind of interfering with one another, and when you do that, you end up with a simple harmonic motion as the resultant of those two interfering rotations. So they're even going further and saying that the rotational motion doesn't need any force to keep it going either. So that's kind of interesting how Larson uses that idea as a justification for his, or even an example for how he had to get a better view of the problem to come up with his photon. And he uses the photon as the example for his breakthrough. but his revisers use the photon as an example of the primary example of what he got wrong. And the reason why he got it wrong is that he adjusted his view but didn't adjust it enough. Like, so he was able to accept that the simple harmonic motion was didn't need another force to keep it going, but he didn't recognize that the rotational motion was the same way. You know, he says earlier, he might even say it coming up here, you can't rotate unless you have something to rotate. But his revisers are saying that rotational motion is just as primary as the translational motion. So that's just an interesting aside. Okay, back to Larson. I had an answer that doesn't require any mathematics. You start out with motion, and motion as such can occur in different forms. In translational motion, you don't require anything to keep it going. It just is. And there's nothing that says it has to go in a straight line. If you have a rotation, in the absence of friction, you can rotate forever. Okay, so Larson is admitting that he knows this, okay? Circumferential motion does have two forces, the pull toward the center and the angular momentum. But pure rotation doesn't require any interaction of forces. So what I finally had to realize is that at the most fundamental level, that is, only one unit at a time, simple harmonic motion is just as permanent as a rotation or as a translational motion. It's really a combination of the two. Now, so that suggests to me that maybe Larson didn't understand. I think this is Euler, the the 18th century major scientist, mathematician, whose name is spelled like Euler. So, but it's apparently pronounced Euler. But that's Euler's equation that two interfering counter-rotating forces, when combine into a simple harmonic motion. I think it's called the epsilon function or something like that. Okay. Okay. Question. Was that the first idea with which you began to diverge from the accepted views? Larson. Well, I can't exactly say where it came in, but that was what I had to realize before I could get started on such things such as the structure of the atom. Because before I could do anything else, I had to have a vibration. And I had to see how that came directly from the postulates rather than as a mathematical result of a disturbing or restoring force, which I didn't have at that stage. Question. You mentioned in one of your lectures that you had these three numbers for the atom, and later you realized that these were the dimensions. Was that part of the mathematical stage of your research? Larson, that was a gradual development. This was when I was still in the inductive phase, still trying to get the mathematics straightened out. It seemed rather obvious that there was some kind of a mathematical pattern in the periodic table. And the first view of it, the one that the chemists have, is that it's a two-component system. That is, they have one series across and one series down. Question. Did you approach the problem from a different angle right from the start? Larson. I did start out with a couple of assumptions. Not assumptions for the purposes of the theory, but assumptions for the purposes of the investigation. I decided that since most of the investigators of this problem had done gases on the theory that gas is the simplest structure, I would make the opposite assumption that the solids are the simplest structure and work on the solids first. And then, since they all started with the assumption that the best way to go about it was to get the properties of hydrogen first and then go on with the more complicated substances later. I decided I should tackle the more complicated substance and work backwards toward hydrogen, starting from the top of the periodic table, or, I guess the bottom of the periodic table instead of the top. Well, those working assumptions turned out pretty well. The solid is, in fact, a good deal simpler than the gas because the simplicity of the gas is deceiving. It comes about because you really disregard the properties of the gas. The gas laws, as we're using them, the properties of gases, are actually the properties of the empty space that we're dealing with. So that in our simple gas phenomenon, we are getting that simplicity by disregarding the phenomenon we're working on. The ideal gas is a gas that has nothing but empty space in it. As soon as you get the properties of the substance itself, then you have to make a correction. As soon as you get to the properties of the substance itself, then you have to make a correction. And you have to correct it down to the recognition of these things you already have in the solid to begin with. So in that way, the solid is the simpler structure. In the other direction, the value of tackling more complicated substances first is that you have a series relation. Okay, I think we're going to stop it right there. And we'll talk about the series relations here of the kind of the higher numbers on the periodic table next time. So thank you for tuning in. Hope to see you soon and have a great day.